As Christians, we know that all of the division in our world is only symptomatic of a far more world-shattering division, and that's the great chasm between man and God. So tonight I want to share a passage of scripture with you all that I think addresses this great chasm. We didn't choose it as one of our readings, but I think it best explains the reason why we're talking about reconciliation here. It's a little bit long, so if you'll bear with me and listen closely and charitably, I think you can get a lot out of it. This is 1 Corinthians 5:14 through 21. For the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. I'm not going to try to unpack all of the profundities of that passage. You might have to take a class with Dr. White for that. But I do want to emphasize one theme, and that's the phrase, the ministry of reconciliation. Paul says that in delivering the message of reconciliation, we are ambassadors for Christ, and God is making his appeal through us. I take the gospel and the ministry of reconciliation here to be synonymous, which means to understand the former, we have to understand the latter. We have to understand the ministry of reconciliation. And I want to focus on two components from that passage of the ministry of reconciliation. There's the idea of a new creation, and there's the idea that all of this is from God. Neither of these ideas, I hope, are like too foreign to our community, but I do hope that our discussion this year has helped us better understand them. So the ministry of reconciliation says that we are a new creation. Paul says that Christ died so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but so that they might live for him who for their sake died and was raised. We started this year with one example of what happens when people live for themselves, what Abraham Lincoln calls the peculiar and powerful interest of slavery, pointing to accursed piles of wealth bought with coursing rivers of blood. America's great sin is one chief symptom of the great disease of division between God and man. But this year we've also seen examples of people who cease to live for themselves. There's the autobiographical story of Reverend John M. Perkins and the fictional story of Reverend John Ames. Both of these exemplified lives transformed by the same forgiveness extended to us in the death of Christ. But there's this other tension that we realized this year, because as we proclaim forgiveness, we also must proclaim an end to injustice. And this is the same tension that's presented in the book of Hosea. Yahweh threatens fierce wrath and punishment while also crying out again and again for his people to repent. We will bear consequences for our cruelty and negligence. And just as we must learn to forgive when we are oppressed and offended, we must also ensure, and maybe even more importantly, ensure that we are not oppressors and offenders ourselves. And this is where the second point of the passage comes in. All this is from God. God reconciled the world to himself, not counting their trespasses. Our performing arts competitions today showed us the limitations of our all too flawed human attempts at reconciliation. So to be ministers of reconciliation is to not only proclaim forgiveness and justice now, but to proclaim the future promise of reconciliation. Dr. Wolf in his lecture the other night, it was actually in the Q&A section, reminded me that forgiveness isn't just like brushing aside offense. I think we think of it a lot of times that way, like forgive and forget. But really, the cross is the ultimate picture of forgiveness. As Christ extends his arms and takes on the full weight of horrible suffering, injustice, and oppression, he also extends his arms to embrace his people. The two are not discrete actions, they're one action. And this embraces the great hope of final reconciliation. And as I crafted this speech, my mind kept coming back to the words of the winning poem from the Interregnum Poetry Competition, which was a new feature this year. Aberdeen Livingstone of the House of Ten Boom begins with a quote from Gilead as her opening line. The line is, "I don't forgive him, I wouldn't know where to begin." And this is the poem. Begin here, with the sunrise soaring over the sea, unstoppable, a silent roar and sweet fury, gathering us all as its crop, reaping what has grown of our love and our hate, shaking the ladder from us like chaff, sewing us again side by side in the soil of our tears. The sun full-grown kisses us, begin here. We so often do not reconcile, indeed we often cannot. But our mission is not to bring full reconciliation for ourselves. It is to be ministers, proclaimers, and co-workers with him who will reconcile all things to himself. Tonight's debate deals with some of the difficulties of this and what the cost is of reconciling. But before I turn it over to our debaters, I want to give a few notes. If you're attending in this room, you can go up to your House liaison or to one of the committee members to get attendance. If you are attending at home, you can fill out the link that'll be sent in the chat. And obviously, if you're in a war room, you can also reach out to your liaison. Please turn your cameras off if you're virtual. Obviously, Dr. Higley, you're excluded from that. And make sure you stay muted. And we will announce the winners after. So we're gonna, once the judges confer, we'll come back with the results and announce the winners from all of fall and spring interregnum, as well as the House Cup winners. So with that, I will pray to kick off our evening. Lord, we thank you that you have done the work of reconciling and that you continue to do the work and that you have promised to complete and fulfill that work. We thank you that we can be a small part of that we can join you in the ministry of reconciliation. And I pray that in some small way or even in some big way that this year has prepared us to do that, that we're better receivers of your grace and better proclaimers of it to a world that desperately needs it. I pray for calm nerves for the debaters tonight and sober minds for the judges. We thank you for this great opportunity, even in the midst of so much uncertainty and unhelpfulness. So we thank you that you are our healer, and we thank you that you are a protector and provider. We give you all of the glory and praise. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, we are gonna get started. So welcome everyone to the final round of Interregnum XVII debates. I'm gonna start by asking the speakers on the government and opposition team to state your names, what position you are, and what house you're in. So we'll start over here with Gov, just speak loud.
I'm Matt Cleveland. I am Prime Minister, and I'm with the House of Reagan.
I'm Josiah Bill. I'm the member of the government. I am of the House of Reagan.
I'm Brent Buderbaugh. I'm the leader of the opposition, and I am in the House of C.S. Lewis.
I'm Justin Fink. I am the member of opposition, and I am in the House of C.S. Lewis.
Thank you, guys. I want to congratulate both the House of Reagan and Lewis for making it this far. It certainly has been an excellent few days of debates. And I want to thank our judges for being here. We have President Gibson, Dean Levy, Letitia, Dr. David Tubbs, and Dr. Mark Hidgley. So thank you guys all for being here tonight and judging our debates. Just a reminder to everyone online, make sure you're keeping your rooms and mics muted. War rooms, you may leave your cameras on, but everybody else, please keep your cameras off. Debaters, I just want to remind you, I will signal your protected time is up with a tap, and when it starts again with another tap, I will show you you have 30 seconds left, and I will tell you your time is up. If you continue past it, I will cut you off. And I'm going to start by reading the motion. So our final debate motion. This House believes that the loss of safety, health, and even life can be justified for the sake of unity. And I'm going to start. I now welcome the Prime Minister to begin their constructive, not to exceed 7 minutes.
Is this a good volume for everybody? Yes. Okay, great. So before I begin and start the timer, I want to thank Raven, Kaylee, Micah, everyone for the Interregnum Committee for throwing this. This has been great. It's been a lot of fun. I want to thank House of Lewis, Brent, Justin. You guys have done a great job. It's a great accomplishment to get here. So thank you to the judges for spending your Friday evening at this event, attempt of a debate we're about to have. So that's great. With that, let's go ahead and start the time. I think Micah really crystallized exactly where our nation is right now. in his opening speech. And I'd like to draw on a little bit of that, of how exactly there is a lot of division in this world right now we're seeing. This is why reconciliation is the theme of this interregnum event. And furthermore, this division often comes from the great chasm between man and God, as Micah even explained. As we know, only God can provide true unity. But we also have to see from that that God wants us to have unity, that there is some inherent value when unity is used correctly, that even God deemed this fitting. So when we look at this motion, I think that we have to look at it in the context of that ultimately systems of government are in place for partly of the purpose of promoting unity and hopefully to provide order. And I think this is ultimately why that the government does indeed have a right to provide some loss of safety, health, and even life, and that it can be justified in the sake of unity. A few key framework ideas that I'd like to get first out on the platter before we even get into some of the main points. And the first of all is that the only institution that is allowed to actually carry out this act is a just government. This is exactly how we are going to frame our debate today, and that a just government is giving this responsibility. But and this is already evident in exactly how the government works today. For example, there is a right on the government side to jail, to execute, to even start war. And that inherently means that there has to be some loss of safety, health, and life. However, there is a higher purpose for that, and ultimately it is often in this case, for the purpose of achieving a form or a sense of unity. And we're going to get into that more later on. But the second point I want to point out is that the motion inherently does not call for us, the government team, to actually require that this is the case in all circumstances. Ultimately, it's not in all cases, but we're asked that this House believes that the loss of safety, health, and even life can be justified. So all we have to prove to you is that there are certain circumstances where a just government is allowed to infringe on safety, health, and well-being for the purpose of the unity of a nation or society as a whole. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, we're going to have two key points on unity and showing you exactly why it is an inherent good, or it is a good that has inherent potential good outcomes.
On that,
And furthermore, just a second, exactly how we've seen through society, government's purpose is to promote that. Yes.
is it possible to be unified towards evil?
That is perfect, because that's exactly what my first point that we're going to be talking about today is, and that is the intermediate good. Now, there are multiple levels of goods. There are the lowest goods, or the inferior, then they're the intermediate, then they're the highest goods. The lowest goods are that of things that we need to survive, water, food, etc. The highest goods are that of virtue, justice, courage, etc. The intermediate goods can be used for both good and bad, and unity is within that intermediate good. But however, that doesn't disprove the point that unity can be used for good. And this is exactly where the burden falls on the government to show that in certain circumstances, this is all we have to prove, is that unity is a good that we ought to strive for. Unity can be used for bad, sure, but we're not asked to ultimately argue in all circumstances unity should be the first and foremost thought. There are only certain cases that we have to prove where it is a good to do so. And that is why ultimately, that leads me to my second main point, which is that for the good of the people. Now, the government's role is ultimately protect the well-being and safety of its people. The protection of the government inherently means that there has to be some sacrifice on the ends and the rights of certain individuals in order to join into this society, this social contract in a way. Now, unity is necessary for a government to properly function. Without unity, it immediately means that there must be some level of chaos that occurs. When we have disorder, and we have disunity amongst its people, a government can't properly operate. Thomas Hobbes even brings this up when he talks about at the worst levels, there's such as war, and disunity. There is a necessity that there must be some level of unity in order to keep a society together, because war and disunity is so bad that the government must take certain acts to restrict certain rights to promote the greater good of unity. So what we've seen is that, for example, we need to look at the overall general unity of a country, or a government needs to look at that furthermore, in order to actually properly function as a government. Because if there is disunity, the government's authority becomes undermined. And this gets into a few examples in a current day, or in the past that we've seen, such as the American Civil War. There was massive disunity between the nation. The North and South both had completely different ideas. But what ultimately ended up occurring is that there had to be a certain level of loss of life, health, and safety in order to bring back unity within the country. I think ultimately that we can see the results of the Civil War as an inherent good. But the only way to achieve that we could foreseeably see, was through a level of loss of life, a loss of health, and a loss of well-being. So in conclusion, I'd like to go over exactly what the contention is of the government side. We don't have to prove in every circumstance that the government is allowed to infringe on health, well-being, safety of life for the purpose of unity. But unity can be used for good. And there are certain scenarios which it is justified for the government to act to ultimately provide or to infringe on certain safety, such as the Civil War, infringe on the loss of life, just as the ability to actually declare war. There are certain levels that allow a government to actually infringe on these rights for the purpose of a justified unity. And this is exactly what I think we're going to show you more throughout this entire debate round. Thank you.
I now open the leader of opposition to begin their constructive, not to exceed 8 minutes.
All right.
The government contends that the burden of their proof lies in the idea that they need to show that unity is justifiably you can infringe upon someone's authority, you can infringe upon people's rights under circumstances that are in pursuit of unity. Sorry, this is a poor introduction. My goal here is to explain that when the government tells you that unity is a paramount good, when they tell you there's inherent good, I raised a point of order, asking and clarifying whether they thought it was possible for one to be unified towards evil. The government tells you, they tell you that unity is a sort of mid-range good. They have the lowest goods, the mid goods, and the ultimate goods. And we tell you that ultimately there is no sacrifice that one can pursue, that one can make, that is made solely in the pursuit of unity. On the opposition case, we're going to argue that sacrifice is ultimately in the pursuit of a higher good, and therefore is not for the sake of unity, as the motion says. We think that our main two constructive points are, first, that unity is never the goal, only the means. And second is that the means should not justify sacrifice. In statesmanship, we are taught that every group should start with the why. I know it's corny to reference this, but the idea is that in every team, every association, every organization, every nation, and every people has a why or a purpose. We think that on side opposition, unity is a means to that purpose. Unity can be good, but it is also incredibly possible and is likely and has been displayed throughout history that unity can be also used for evil. The government brings up the example of the Civil War. This is an excellent example because the South was unified in the defense and the perpetuation of slavery. We think that it's important to recognize that unity is not necessarily an inherent good. I think it's also important to understand that the goal of unity is never something through which a sacrifice is made. A sacrifice is made in this pursuit of a higher purpose, the pursuit of a higher goal or why. I think that it's important to understand
that when the government tells us that there are systems in place for unity and order, it's important to understand that these systems are often not just in execution. So the government tells us the only institution that's able to carry this out is a just government. We think this is true, but also it doesn't really prove their burden, which is to say that unity is the pursuit, or unity is for the sake of unity is what we are trying to accomplish. And so, for example, if the New York City government were to evict and exile all New York Mets fans, that would achieve unity, but that would not necessarily be a good. That would not necessarily be something worth the sake of sacrificing. I understand this does not prove our burden, and it certainly doesn't refute their burden, but it does go to show that unity is not a ultimate good, and therefore not the sense and the purpose for which sacrifice is being made. So what we understand on this side opposition is that unity is not the purpose. When we look back to the prompt, we were asked to consider whether sacrifice of life, sacrifice of health, sacrifice of safety is made in the pursuit, or should be is justified in the pursuit of unity. We say that it's not for these reasons. We think that unity exists in a classification of descriptors like energy, drive, motivation, and enthusiasm. These are all means. These are all ways these are all means towards end. And we think that it is not correct for the government to get up here and to say that unity is good, therefore sacrifice is worth making on behalf of unity. And so we think that it's important to understand this sort of distinction. Unity is never the goal, and unity is only a means. Unity is only a means for the higher purpose. Any questions?
Not at this time.
Great. All right. So we think that the government case here is not engaging with the motion when they tell us that the good of the people, when they tell us that the pursuit of unity is an ultimate good. We think that on side opposition, you get a better engagement with the motion, and you get a better justification for a better realization and for understanding unity. So we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your perspective. We now turn to the member of the government to offer their perspective, not to exceed 8 minutes.
I'll begin. I think today that I'm going to answer the only one point that the opposition has made so far against the government's contention that loss of life, loss of health, and loss of safety can be justified in the pursuit of unity. And we want to reinforce some of the points that we made earlier and even expand on some of those and add a couple more. So first I want to respond to the idea that because unity is not the ultimate goal, therefore the prompt or the motion removes its ability to be used in this language. It says justified for the sake of unity. The one argument the opposition made was that because unity is not the ultimate goal, we can't use that language, and that therefore we have not addressed the problem. But I want to disagree with that entire assessment of that sentence. If you pursue something for the sake of something, we truly want unity. We want unity to be the outcome of something, of an action. Just because that outcome is to be used for something else does not mean that we have not wanted the outcome that we got. So if I pursue an action for the outcome of unity, it is for the sake of unity that I pursue that outcome. Just because I want to take unity and use it for something else does not mean that we are not pursuing this thing for the sake of unity. We have agreed on the government side that unity can be used for wrong. Unity in a band of robbers, a bad thing, because it allows them to rob people more effectively. Unity in governments that are unjust can be argued to be a bad thing because it allows them to oppress their people more than they would have been able to. But unity in a just government for just ends is a good, is something to be justified. And I think that sits in the motion sentence that it can be justified for the sake of unity. So we, in that sentence, I think we can define those situations in which it can be justified. And those situations are a government to which is pursuing the best ends of its people.
Yes, is the goal of a just government unity, or is it unity to a higher end? Is it unity to prosperity? Is it unity to virtue?
Well, I believe I just spent a couple 30 seconds answering that exact question, and the answer is no, it's not, but that doesn't mean that we are not seeking certain things for the sake of unity simply because we are using unity for something else. It can still be justified for the sake of unity, which is our contention. And so that's what the opening section of my speech was about, is that I think it's incorrect to say that just because the prompt says for the sake of unity, and there are higher goods, that therefore we can't use the term that is for the sake of. Otherwise, do you seek health? Do you seek to eat well for the sake of health? I think it's pretty obvious that you do seek to eat well for the sake of health, even though health in and of itself, I think, could be argued to be the highest good, but it could also be argued that you're only using health to achieve certain ends. You're using health to do things in your life that are profitable. You're using health to escape pain, those sorts of things. But you're still seeking to eat well for the sake of health. So that's what the whole opening section of my speech was about. Sure, I'll take your view.
Yeah, so talking about like health as not necessarily being an end goal, I don't think that necessarily makes sense here, because some of the things that like we brought up that I think we're all agreeing is an end goal, like for example, prosperity. You can seek prosperity to avoid poverty. Literally anything, especially end goals, can be to avoid something else if you're trying to frame it that way.
That was exactly my point. That if you want to frame it in whatever way you want, you can use this sentence to mean that. When the motion asks us to say, can it be justified for the sake of unity? It can be in this case. And so health, if you frame it in that light, could be used as the sake, or it could not be seen as for the sake of, depending on how you are framing your position on the scale of what you're trying to do, depending on where you're looking at it. One of them is the sake of, but this is just sort of advancing to this point, talking about how this promotion, what it's asking us to define. And it's asking us if it can be justified for the sake of unity. So I want to go back to the fact that a government is able to deprive people of safety, health, and even life for the sake of unity. A government can't exist without depriving something from someone else, depriving some sorts of rights from the people. It has to have some sort of enforcement, some sort of imposition upon the people in order to enforce anything or to even exist. When we come together, we're giving up those things for the sake of a unified existence in which we are protected. And so, in the case of this prompt, safety, health, and even life can be given up so that we can provide a greater good to everyone. So we can take the safety, health, and even life of individuals and for the greater good of the people. As Max brought up, in the case of the Civil War, or in the case of any civil war, you're fighting for unity. You're giving up life for that unity so that you may continue in providing those goods for people, or in maybe pure existence of your government in general. As we brought up, as Max brought up in the first piece, we need unity in order to exist as a government. So to come back and recap everything I've been saying in conclusion. In the motion is to ask us that if safety, health, and even life can be justified for the sake of unity. And the government stands on the idea that it can be in the case of a justified government, a government that derives its rights from the people, from the consent of the governed. It inherently must be able to deprive the safety, health, and even life of its citizens in certain cases. Unity being necessary for the very existence of that government must be one of those things to which safety, health, and even life can be justified in certain cases can be justified. Not in all cases, as the government can clearly abuse those powers, but in certain cases, it can be justified. Thank you.
Thank you, member of government, for your perspective. I now welcome the member of opposition to begin their perspective, not to exceed 8 minutes.
All right, I will begin my timer in 3, 2, 1. All right, so a lot of what we've heard from the Gov bench so far hinges along their argument that this can only be done by a just government in the pursuit of something that is good and just. And the one question that I have for them with this argument is who? Who is deciding that this is a just government that's doing it? Is it the government? Because I think that almost every single entity in history would argue that they were the good side of history. The Civil War, with the example you brought up, the North and the South both thought they were arguing for good and that they were fighting for good. Who's to decide that these actions are just? Is it the masses of the people? Because obviously there are severe problems with that. Is it God? Because not everyone subscribes to the same religion. And also, if we're having God decide what is good, it's not necessarily easy for everyone to see and everyone to agree on what God thinks is the good and just option. So we don't think that saying that this can only be used by a just government in the pursuit of good makes sense, because with this argument, there will inherently be a ton of unjust governments or entities using this for evil who claim to be good, and we think that this argument throws them in there. Yeah.
Do you believe that there is such a thing as what is actually true and good in reality, regardless of what people believe it to be?
I think that there is things that are good and true based on what people believe them to be, but I don't think that there's necessarily, let me back up. I do think that there is something such as like inherent good or universal agreed upon good. But in these instances, I don't think it's possible for a government to achieve that. Because as you said, for a government to exist, they have to regulate rights or take away rights from people. So take, for example, the Civil War. The North, which you were arguing as the just government, was taking away life from the South. The South did not view that as good. So if we're only saying that the winning side is the good and just government and that they're deciding, that doesn't make sense, because that automatically leads to a lot of situations where, as I've already said, evil and unjust governments can reign. Truth and justice are both very subjective, and while there are such things as like inherent truth in a minimum, for a government to achieve that is nearly impossible, because as Gov has said, for a government to operate, they need to take things away from other people. Yes.
Say me and you were playing basketball and I step out of bounds and then shoot a 3-pointer. You say I stepped out of bounds, but I say I didn't. Is it not true that there is one truth that I did step out of bounds, regardless of my opinion or your opinion, correct?
Yeah, but so the problem is with this like safe, health and even loss of life for unity, I'm not gonna say you stepped out of bounds, we're gonna argue, and then I'm gonna kill you over it. We're not gonna go and sacrifice this safety, health, or life over this for the sake of unity, because those simple truths that everyone can agree upon don't necessarily need to be in this instance, because we think that just governments are subjective in the sense that almost everyone can agree upon these universal truths that, depending on your opinion, are objective. We don't think that it's important in this argument because it's saying that it's for the sake of unity. Next, I want to go back into one of the points that Brent was making, that unity is not the end goal. Now, government refuted this by saying that they're risking life for unity so that they can get to their end goal, and they're using unity to get there, and that's why these actions can be justified. We don't think that this is the case, because if you're trying to justify this loss of safety, health, and even life for unity that is going to be used to get you somewhere else, you are justifying these losses for the place that unity is eventually going to lead you. What I was trying to bring up in my POI was the sense that, like, the end goal of prosperity, for the example that I brought up. Yes, prosperity can be used like to avoid things, or can be used to get you to other places, but prosperity is an end goal in the sense that prosperity alone inherently brings many good things for a people. Unity alone, with nothing else, going nowhere else, doesn't necessarily bring any good. And we feel that that is why we're not justifying these losses for the sake of unity. We are justifying them for the sake of unity that reaches you towards your end goal, which we don't think is the sake of unity. We think that we think that you are justifying it for the sake of your end goal. Yes.
Can you just clarify your opinion? You said on prosperity, that prosperity was indeed an end.
Yes. We think that, like, prosperity, protection, stuff like that, those are ends that governments are trying to reach. And we think that unity can be a stepping stone there. But again, as I've said multiple times, we don't think that it's fair to say that you're seeking these losses to justify the unity that you will be used to get there, because you are justifying for the sake of the end goal you're trying to meet. Now, just to go into a quick weighing mechanism that I think should be used by this debate, or for this debate, excuse me. What we feel like Gov's burden is, and what Gov needs to do, is they need to explain the goods that directly come from unity for unity's sake. Not unity for the sake of getting you to another goal, but unity for the sake of having unity and nothing else. And they need to explain what those goods are and why they outweigh the losses of safety, health, and even life. On the ops side, all we need to do is to show you that those goods either don't exist, or they simply do not outweigh these losses that Gov is trying to tell you they need to take. And we feel that throughout both of our speeches and in Brent's next speech, we will show you that these benefits that come from unity for unity's sake both do not exist, and therefore obviously do not outweigh the losses. Because again, unity for unity's sake is not inherently good. Unity for something else is, but you are not justifying your actions for the unity. You are justifying your actions for something else. Also, as Brent had said, unity is kind of classified under, or some like other examples of things that are under the same like stepping stone as unity would be like motivation or energy or drive. Again, we don't think that anyone would take these losses purely for energy's sake or purely for motivation's sake. They would take them so that people could be motivated or have energy towards their end goal. And it's for these reasons we are proud to oppose this motion.
I now welcome the Leader of Opposition to return to the floor and offer their rebuttal, not to exceed 6 minutes, and wherein they may offer no new arguments. No new constructive arguments.
Ready?
Yes.
All right. I think that
want to apologize. I think this has been a rather messy round for a lot of reasons. And so if this is the first debate you've watched all NRA, I'm really sorry about that. I think that one of the things that's been really, really difficult within the course of this round to understand is the weighing between what unity is and whether it is the pursuit or the means. On side op, we tell you it is the means to the end. Government tries to tell you, and Max starts with this, his first part of his first speech, is where he says, unity is an inherent good. On the opposition side, we oppose this categorization. We think that it's really important for understanding the way in this round to know that unity is not an inherent good. Justin and I have talked extensively about why this is not the case. Many different organizations, and the government team will tell you this themselves, can be unified towards an evil end, towards a malicious end. We think that it is really important to understand unity that we seek is not ever something that is worth sacrificing for in and of itself. Rather, sacrifices are to be made in the pursuit of a higher good, in the pursuit of prosperity, in the pursuit of virtue, in the pursuit of honor, in the pursuit of helping others. The idea that a group or an entity of any kind exists purely to promote unity is ridiculous. Whatever, you've never been a part of a team, you've never been a part of a business, you've never been a part of a school that says we exist to be with each other and to be unified in that. That's not how the world works. That's not how unity is supposed to function. It's not how sacrifice works. No one in their right mind is going to sacrifice themselves for the concept of unification. I think that it's really important to understand that when Justin and I tell you that it is really important that unity be viewed not as the goal but as the means, that you understand this as the defining point within the course of this debate. I think that to bring back to the beginning of the debate, our two constructors, the idea that unity is not the goal, it is the means, and the second is that means should not justify sacrifice. I think that the government team, they really hang their hat on this idea that the just government is able to pursue unity. The just government has this sort of locked-in idea that the people cede rights to the government can act upon it, and the government has this idea, has this ability to request and demand, and that the people cede some of their rights. We think this is true, but they're not doing it just to be unified. They're doing it for other things that they're being given protection, for community, for prosperity. We think that it's really important to understand the idea that people aren't just giving away their rights in order to have unity. So when Justin tells you that it's important to understand who is deciding what is just, we think this is really important because the government exists in this hypothetical world of just governments, which we tell you doesn't exist. And even if it did, it still would not be actually achieving unity. And if it is achieving unity, unity is not the inherent good that we seek, and any sacrifices made towards it are not actually going to be achieved. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of what the government has gone into. They've sort of run a couple circles around the idea of good people sacrificing on behalf of the rest of the people. Again, I ask you, what is that sacrifice for? It's not just so that we have unity, whatever that means. We think that it's important to understand the circumstances in which that sacrifice is made and the pursuit in which it is made towards. I asked the government in the final speech to give me one example of a sacrifice that is made for the cause of unity as a concept. We think that it's really important that when the government tells us what unity is, they need to give us a weighing mechanism to understand why it is inherent good. Justin produced a weighing mechanism in his last speech where he says that our burden of proof is to show that unity isn't inherently good, or that the good that it produces is outweighed by the harms. We take it on this. I think that we take this round on that first part of the burden, understanding that unity is not inherent good. The government has not showed us why this is the case or why we should be trusting their framework that a just government is able to pursue good unity, and then that makes unity good. Okay, so pointing back to the motion. The motion asks us to examine whether it is appropriate for, in the pursuit of unity, to demand of someone sacrifice of safety, of health, and of life. We tell you that sacrifices are indeed, there are many circumstances under which we understand as Christians, as Americans, in any situation that you find yourself in, you may be asked to make sacrifices. We think that's entirely appropriate. We think the government has every right to claim that sacrifices are good. What is not necessarily good is the pursuit of unity, because unity can be used for all kinds of ends. this means, we think is really important to consider. We think that it's important not to understand unity as an end in of itself, but as the means. This is why we are so proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your rebuttal. I now welcome the Prime Minister to close the round with their rebuttal that may not exceed 7 minutes and wherein they may offer no new constructive arguments.
Alrighty. If everyone's ready? Great. Beginning now. So for this final speech, I'm going to crystallize the key arguments that were brought up throughout this entire debate round and go over the last 2 speeches that the opposition gave. And I'm going to prove to you exactly how the opposition has actually contradicted themselves on what exactly true unity looks like. And then I'm going to show exactly how we have proven that in certain scenarios, that the loss of well-being, life, and safety actually is a good that the government does have the ability to restrict in order for the just cause of providing unity. Now, they brought up in Justin's first speech the fact that we don't really know what a just government is, and everyone has a different idea of what a just government is. Therefore, we don't know who's to decide. He brought up the example of the Civil War, where both sides thought they were right. Both sides thought they were just. First of all, that's not really the point behind our contention that a just government is required for restricting the idea of safety, well-being, et cetera, for the sake of unity, because we just have to prove that there are examples of this. But second of all, it also doesn't really have any weighing on this round because there is an example of a just government. I mean, it doesn't matter whether the North or South thought they were right. One of them was just. And it doesn't matter what the opinions or perceptions of that was. I went through in this kind of basketball example that I asked him earlier, if I step out of bounds and then shoot a 3-pointer to score, and I claim I didn't step out of bounds, I didn't break the rules, but he claimed I did, well, one of us is right. One of us has the just opinion in this scenario. So just because everyone has a different view of it doesn't mean that there isn't an ability to have a just government make these decisions. But the next point, and this is basically the main point that the opposition has actually brought up this entire round. Now, Brent said at the beginning, this has gotten very messy. Sorry about this, but actually, I think the opposition side actually clarified this in the point of information that I asked earlier. I asked Justin, is prosperity an end? And he said, yes, for the government, prosperity is an end. Well, that just supports the entire point of the government side. Prosperity can be used for higher goods. Okay, prosperity in and of itself, of having wealth and money, etc., does not make us virtuous people. Okay, there is something beyond prosperity. Yet Justin agreed in the point of information that an end of government was prosperity. And that is in the exact same way that the government side has actually been arguing that unity in and of itself is, in fact, an end of government. Okay, and it is for this reason that the opposition time has undermines the main point that they have brought up in their case, that has been to dispute our opinion, dispute our arguments. Furthermore, I think it is valuable to have a function valuable to have unity simply for the purpose of a functioning government. Government needs a level of unity. We have been some of the most disunified America has ever seen before. And what are the results of this? Some of these results happen to be political craziness. I mean, there have been riots in the streets for the entire year. This is exactly what happened. The Capitol has been stormed. This is what a disunified country looks like. So there has to be some value in and of itself as well that for the purposes of a government function. So to clarify on this main point, that unity is not an end, that the opposition has based their entire claims on, all of their arguments on. We have once more shown that there is a contradiction on the opposition side, where they said that prosperity, for example, is an end of government. Well, that then directly applies to our side, where we say unity, although there are some greater things for it, can be an end of government, because they've said an intermediate good could be an end of government when I asked them in their point of information. But furthermore, we can even look at things for the sake of. This is the key end of the entire motion here. It says for the sake of unity. I think Josiah crystallizes very well. You eat well, you be physically fit, etc., for the sake of health. However, health is not the main good that you wish to achieve. Health, it is for the good of being able to live well. And this is what health is for. But we still say it's for the sake of health. And this is three main refutations to the points that have been brought up by the opposition side. Now, I'd like to go forward with the final 2 minutes of this speech and basically argue or show exactly what we have been saying in the entire round as the government side. We are not, once again, and this needs to be stressed, not much more, but we are not required to show this in every case that invading on certain safety, well-being, etc., livelihood is okay for a just cause of unity. Not in every case, but there has to be some ability for the government to do so, because unity is vital for the foundation of government. It is unity that is vital for it. And for this reason, and as we've seen in the Civil War, an example that has been largely, the root of our example has been largely unrefuted, is that unity was an end that was deemed valuable because disunity caused chaos, not order. And there needed to be some level of loss of life and lives put on the line for the sake of unity. And this is a great example of how this is applied. We've given you examples in cases where this is the case. We have given you examples of the example showing you that this is required for the ability for a government to properly function. And the opposition side has not had a coherent argument strategy against the government side, except for the argument that unity is not the end goal. So we can't do it for anything for the sake of. However, I'd like to reiterate exactly what we've said before. It can still be an end, even if it's not the high, it can still be a goal, even if it's not the highest goal. And we brought this up through the example of the basketball, we brought this up through the example of health, etc. And also the government, the opposition side has brought it up as well, saying that a governmental end is prosperity, which is another intermediate good. We're not claiming unity is perfect in all scenarios, but in certain scenarios, it is required, especially for the proper functioning of government. And it's for these reasons that I ultimately think that the government does have a right to, in certain scenarios, infringe on the livelihood, the wellness, etc., of its citizens for the purpose of promoting unity. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your rebuttal, and thank you to all the debaters for this excellent round. Thank you also to the judges for your time and deliberation today. You may now move to the Founders Room, where Dr. Hidgley will join you on Zoom for deliberation. Students, you can find someone in a name tag to get credit for being here, or Emma or Raven is going to be putting a link in the chat online for everyone to get credit as well. Thanks again for coming, and we are hoping to announce the results at 8:30.